welcome to the 13th episode of RNV Talks, in which we'll be discussing many different aspects of the history and culture of the Roma minority. This podcast is released as part of the project EUROMIJA, implemented by the Roma National Council of Croatia in the framework of the European Solidarity Corps. Let's see what the team has in store for us today.
Today we're discussing the Crimean Roma, a relatively small but fascinating ethnic group whose history is deeply intertwined with that of the Crimean Tatars, the Ottoman world, and the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and some of the most dramatic events of the 20th century. The Crimean Roma represent a unique branch of the wider Roma people. Through centuries of coexistence with Crimean Tatars, many adopted Islam, developed a distinct identity, and transformed their language into something quite different from other Romani dialects. Yet, despite their rich history, very few people have heard of them. In this episode, we'll trace their origins, examine how they formed a distinct community, and explore how war, deportation, genocide, and migration reshaped their lives.
Okay, so before we get into the history, who exactly are the Crimean Roma?
That's actually a more complicated question than it first appears. Researchers Janusz Panchenko and Mikola Homaniuk emphasize an important distinction. They note that there's a difference between the Roma of Crimea and the Crimean Roma. The term Roma of Crimea simply refers to all Roma groups that have lived on the Crimean Peninsula. But the Crimean Roma are something more specific. They are a distinct ethnic community that developed its own identity, language, traditions, and a collective sense of belonging. Historically, they referred to themselves by names such as Krimi, Krimska Roma, and Krima.
So, we're not just talking about Roma who happen to live in Crimea. We're talking about a separate subgroup that emerged there over time.
Exactly. Today, many Crimean Roma no longer live in Crimea itself. Communities can be found across mainland Ukraine, Russia, parts of the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Estimates suggest that their total population is somewhere between 12 and 15,000 people, although accurate modern statistics are kind of difficult to obtain.
So that makes them a very small community.
Indeed, which is one reason why their history often receives little attention.
So one thing that immediately stands out is that historians don't seem entirely sure where or when the Crimean Roma came from.
That's right. The Crimean Roma emerged through multiple migration waves over several centuries. This makes it difficult to pinpoint a single origin. Historical evidence suggests that different Roma groups arrived in Crimea at different times and from different regions. The result was a gradual blending of communities rather than one single migration event.
So instead of one founding population, we're looking at several groups arriving over generations?
Exactly. One of the most influential theories comes from Bulgarian scholars Elena Marushiakova and Veselin Popov, who identified two major Roma groups connected with Crimea, the Daifa and the Krimi, and these groups had different migration histories and cultural characteristics. Let's start with the Daifa. According to research, the Daifa migrated to Crimea sometime between the 16th and the 18th centuries from Asia Minor, or what is now largely modern Turkey. Their name comes from a Tatar word meaning a clan, tribe, or family. This is significant because it already points to a strong cultural connection with Turkic-speaking populations.
And this was during the period of the Crimean Khanate.
Exactly. At the time, the Crimean Khanate was ruled by Crimean Tatar Khans, who were allied with and subordinate to the Ottoman Empire. The Black Sea region was heavily influenced by Ottoman political and economic networks. As a result, movement between Anatolia, the Balkans, and Crimea was relatively common.
And travelers from the period mentioned Roma communities there?
One important source is the famous Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, who visited Crimea in the 17th century and documented many aspects of life in the region. His writings provide evidence supporting the presence of Roma populations in Crimea during that era.
And how distinct were the Daifa from the other Roma groups?
Well, over time, many became heavily integrated into Crimean Tatar society. They adopted the Tatar language, they practiced Islam, and increasingly identified with the surrounding Tatar population. In some cases, their Roma origins became less prominent than their Tatar cultural identity.
And what about the second group, the Krimi?
The Krimi appear to have followed a different path. Researchers believe they arrived between the 17th and 18th centuries from the Balkans through Wallachia or Moldova. Compared to the Daifa, they retained relatively stronger links to their Romani heritage. Their language remained rooted in Romani speech, although it gradually absorbed substantial Tatar influences.
So these were the people who largely shaped what became the Crimean Romani language.
Exactly. Through centuries of interaction with Crimean Tatars, they developed a unique linguistic form that blended Romani foundations with Turkic influences. This linguistic evolution became one of the defining features of Crimean Roma identity.
That's so interesting because it shows how identities aren't static.
Absolutely. The Crimean Roma are a perfect example of cultural adaptation. They preserved elements of the Roma heritage while simultaneously integrating aspects of Tatar culture, religion, and language. The next major turning point came in 1783 when the Russian Empire annexed Crimea. This event fundamentally transformed life for everyone living on the peninsula.
Including both the Tatars and the Roma?
Very much so. For centuries, Crimea had been connected politically and culturally to the Ottoman world. The Russian conquest disrupted those ties and created uncertainty for Muslim communities. Large numbers of Crimean Tatars emigrated to Ottoman territories. Some left voluntarily, while others felt increasing pressure from Russian authorities.
And because many Roma identified closely with the Tatars, they likely migrated as well.
Exactly. Although records are incomplete, historians believe substantial numbers of Crimean Roma participated in these migration waves. The process accelerated during and after the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. Russian authorities increasingly viewed Muslim populations with suspicion. As conditions worsened, more Tatars and likely many Roma relocated to Ottoman lands, especially present-day Turkey. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 brought another period of upheaval. The revolution, civil war, and eventual rise of Soviet power transformed Crimea yet again.
And I imagine many minority communities often suffered increasingly during these transitions.
Exactly. Political instability created uncertainty for everyone. Then came Stalin's collectivization campaigns in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Agricultural collectivization caused catastrophic famines across many regions of the Soviet Union, and to survive, many Crimean Roma left the peninsula and moved elsewhere within the Soviet territory.
So migration wasn't always political. Sometimes it was simply about survival.
That's an important point. Economic pressures often shaped migration just as much politics did. The Second World War brought one of the darkest chapters in the Crimean Roma history. In 1941, Nazi Germany occupied Crimea. As part of their racial ideology, the Nazis targeted both Jews and Roma for extermination.
Many people know about the Holocaust, but fewer know about the genocide of the Roma.
That's true. The Roma genocide is often referred to as Poraimos. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of Roma were murdered. In Crimea, German occupation authorities carried out mass killings of Roma communities. The Nazis considered Roma racially inferior and sought their elimination.
So Crimean Roma faced genocide simply because of who they were.
Exactly. For many communities, the occupation years were devastating. Families were destroyed, traditions disrupted, and entire local populations disappeared. Unfortunately, liberation from Nazi occupation did not bring relief. In 1944, after Soviet forces retook Crimea, another tragedy unfolded. The Soviet government ordered the mass deportation of Crimean Tatars.
And this is one of the most significant events in modern Crimean history.
Absolutely. The Soviet leadership accused the Crimean Tatars collectively of collaboration with the Germans. Regardless of individual actions, entire communities were punished. Hundreds of thousands were deported primarily to Uzbekistan and other regions of Central Asia.
And the Crimean Roma were caught up in this process.
Yes, some Roma were officially registered as Tatars and deported alongside them. Others were classified separately as Roma but still removed from Crimea. Historical documents show at least 1,109 Roma that were deported, although researchers believe that the true number was higher.
So this wasn't a targeted action against specific individuals?
No, it was a collective punishment. Entire populations were uprooted regardless of personal guilt or innocence. The deportations shattered centuries of coexistence between Crimean Tatars and Crimean Roma.
And what happened after the deportation?
Well, many Crimean Roma found themselves in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other parts of Central Asia. Life was extremely difficult. People had to rebuild communities from scratch under harsh conditions. Families were separated from their homes, traditions, and historical homeland.
And unlike some other deported groups, they couldn't return for quite some time.
Correct. After Stalin's death, Soviet policies gradually changed. Beginning in 1956, many deported peoples were rehabilitated and allowed to return home. However, Crimean Tatars were largely excluded. As a result, many Crimean Roma associated with the Tatars were also unable to return. For decades, they remained in exile. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Crimean Tatars organized campaigns demanding the right to return, and some attempted to resettle in Crimea illegally. Many faced renewed persecution. Only in 1989, during the final years of the Soviet Union, were Crimean Tatars officially allowed to return. Large-scale resettlements followed, and the Tatar population in Crimea increased dramatically over the following years. Some Crimean Roma also returned during this period, though precise figures remain unknown.
So after nearly half a century, some families finally returned to their ancestral homeland.
Yes, although many others remained in Central Asia or elsewhere.
All right, but what do we know about the Crimean Roma today?
Unfortunately, reliable demographic data is scarce. Some remain in Crimea, others live throughout Ukraine, Russia, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia. Their community remains dispersed as a result of centuries of migration and displacement.
Yet despite all of this, they've managed to preserve a distinct identity.
That's perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story. Over centuries, they experienced migration, imperial conquest, famine, genocide, deportation, exile, and political upheaval. Yet a distinct Crimean Roma identity survived. Their language, traditions, and collective memory continue to connect people scattered across multiple countries. The history of the Crimean Roma reminds us that Europe's past is far more diverse and interconnected than we often imagine. Their story sits at the crossroads of Roma history, Crimean Tatar history, Ottoman history, Russian imperial expansion, Soviet repression, and World War II. It is a story of adaptation and resilience, but also of repeated displacement and suffering.
And it's a reminder that smaller communities can tell us just as much about history as the larger nations and empires.
And sometimes even more, because their experiences reveal how major historical events affected ordinary people.
Thank you for listening to our talk on Crimean Roma history, migration, and survival. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.